Good evening. My name's Doug Griffin. It's April 13th, 2022. This is my Wednesday night Bible study. We're studying John, the fifth chapter. We're going through the whole book of John. We're starting John chapter 5. Feel free to go back. And if you're just now listening for the first time, start at the beginning of John. Also, we did Matthew right before this, and someone was asking. He said he wanted to read through the Bible, and I suggested, oh, go back to where I was teaching in Matthew and go all the way through. We're reading John specifically because he has such a unique perspective. The other three books of the Bible were already written by the time John wrote his, and so he's kind of filling in the gaps, and he organizes his around these various trips to Jerusalem that Jesus is making, and starts at the beginning of his ministry, and it takes us through the end. But he's writing to a church that's already formed. Matthew's preaching to Jews who have not, who are just hearing it for the first time, and he has a lot of prophecies that are being fulfilled in the book of Matthew. He says Jesus did this to fulfill this prophecy from Isaiah, and he did this to fulfill this prophecy from Malachi, and on. Because the Jews have the Talmud, what we would call the Old Testament, and they're looking for this Messiah to fit certain things. And so Matthew's saying, hey, here's where he did fit all these things. Mark is preaching to the Romans. Mark has so many miracles. He just packs them in. And he's watched Jesus for 3.5 years. Well, he recorded what Jesus did for 3.5 years. He actually got a lot of his information from Peter, who was there. And he writes down all of these miracles because the Romans are into power. Like, they want to know if you're a powerful person. And he's writing to Romans. Mark is part Roman. And so he wants them to know Jesus is powerful. Luke's writing to the Greeks. They're into philosophy. So there's, if you want to find a parable, go to the book of Luke. It's probably there, because he's writing down all of his philosophies of life, because that's what the Greeks are impressed with. How do you see the world? But John's writing to Christians. He's writing to a church that's already formed, saying, here's what's important to us about what Jesus said. So we're in John chapter 5. In verse 1, it says, after this, there's a piece of the Jews. Well, after what? Okay, Jesus had gone to, he'd been baptized by John. He'd gone down to Jerusalem for the first Passover. He had gone into the temple and turned it over. So he starts off his ministry by going into the temple and turning it over. And at the end of 3.5 years, he goes back into the temple, and they're not any better, and he overturns it a second time. And then Jesus goes up to Samaria, talks to the woman at the well at Samaria, and then she begins to go out and spread the gospel. And then Jesus goes up to Galilee. He goes to his hometown of Nazareth. Nazareth is in Galilee. So I always divide Israel into the north, central, and south. So he goes now, he's in the north, and he's in his hometown. They don't want to hear it. Jesus, who? We know you. You were a carpenter all this time, and suddenly you're the Messiah. Please explain that to me. So he can't do anything there in his hometown because they don't believe him. Then a nobleman, a king's man, and we think he worked with Herod. He worked for Herod. Comes and says, please pray for my son. My child is dying, and he's in Capernaum. Please come with me to Capernaum. And Jesus says, just go. Your son lives. And at this point, he has the choice to argue with Jesus. No, I just saw my son, and he's not. No, come with me. Or he has to just believe. He has to just walk away and say, okay, I guess I'm just going to have to believe. And when he gets part of the way there, his servants come out to say, hey, your son is healed. And, well, when did this happen? Yesterday. And he realizes right when Jesus said he's healed, that's when the healing happened. Sometimes it may take us a while to see the result of the healing, but when God says it, that's when it's done. not when we see the result of it. That's just when we see the result of it. It's like taking medicine. You may not feel the result on the outside, but it's already doing its work on the inside. And so uh, wow. So, and Jesus is showing something. I am master of space and time. I don't have to be there in person. If I've said it, that's good enough. So there's a lesson there for us. Then it says, after these things. So after he's gone to Samaria, gone around Galilee, in John chapter 5, verse 1, it says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So he comes back down south now. Second trip down there. This feast is the biggest in contention. Like, which feast is this? Because it doesn't say. It just says there was a feast of the Jews. So there are those who say this could not have been Passover, because every time there was a Passover, John said, and he went to Jerusalem for Passover. In fact, he was just in Jerusalem for Passover. And in John chapter 6, he's going to be back in Jerusalem for Passover. So, so in John chapter 6, verse 1, it says, now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near, and Jesus was, so in the next chapter, so they're saying this could not have been Passover because John would have said it's Passover. So they believe it was the Feast of Purim. Now, John chapter 4, so in the last chapter, in verse 35, it says, Jesus says, do you not say there are still 4 months and then comes the harvest? And he's very specific. This is happening somewhere at the end of the year, December, or the beginning of the year, January, when he says this, because in 4 months, in April, there's going to be the harvest. So they kind of know when Jesus is saying this. In John chapter 4, he says, do you not say there are still 4 months and then the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest. So don't even wait. He's using it as a metaphor, like you're sitting around waiting to start witnessing to people, but they're already out there ready. But his point is, I understand you saying that we've got 4 more months, but I'm telling you, you don't got 4 months. You can start. You don't have to wait. So they believe, well, they know for sure. Jesus is saying this around the very 1st of January, the end of December. So in John chapter 4, it's January, December. In John chapter 6, it's April. So John chapter 5 had to have happened somewhere between January and April. There's only one feast that happens between January and April. It's the Feast of Purim. And it's significant for these reasons. What is the Feast of Purim and why are you making this so important? Okay, Feast of Purim happened when it began when the Jews were in exile in Babylon. And in Esther chapter 3, it's all about Esther, Queen Esther, how she saves her people, like they're all ready to be exterminated, but Esther saved her people. In Esther chapter 3, verse 1, it says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman. Now, King Ahasuerus is, while they're in Babylon, while they have been captured, he became king, and he promotes Haman. It says, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, A-G-A-G, Agagite. So he's an Agagite. And what's an Agagite? Okay, I'll tell you a second. So he promoted him and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. So he's from the line of Agag, A-G-A-G. In 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 18, Samuel is talking to Saul. He says, now the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. So destroy them all until they are consumed, all of them. Verse 20, and Saul said to Samuel, well, I've obeyed the voice of the Lord. Because Samuel's like saying, you didn't do what God said. He says you to totally destroy all the Amalekites. You didn't do what God said. And Saul says, no, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and I've gone on a mission on which the Lord sent me, but I brought back Agag, A-G-A-G, king of Amalek. So I brought back the king. I mean, I'm sure he doesn't want me to destroy the king. I've utterly destroyed all the rest of the Amalekites, he says. I just didn't destroy the king. And we're like that with God. Well, I know God said, throw away all your cigarettes, but he didn't mean all my cigarettes. I mean, we try to, I know God said do this, but he didn't mean, God said read my Bible every day, but not like every day. Certainly not on Tuesday because that's my bowling night or whatever. You know, we come up with something that we say, well, God didn't mean it all. So he doesn't kill Agag, A-G-A-G. And Haman is a descendant of Agag. He's his descendant. Now, this is now 500 years later. God knew what he was doing. I want you to destroy all of them, including King Agag. Please, what can happen? What can happen is the worst that can happen. So now King Ahasuerus has captured the Jews, brought them to Babylon. It wasn't him, but his predecessor did that, and now he's king there. And he's promoted Haman, who's a descendant of Agag, over all of them. And in Esther chapter 3, verse 5, it says, and when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, because he's just been promoted. I'm over everybody. How dare you not bow to me? Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. So he thought, you know, I could just get Mordecai right now, but I don't want to get just him. I want to get him and all his people. And that'll show him, because I've been promoted. I'm descended from King Agag, and I've got all this position. He's not bowing down to me. So instead of just going after Mordecai, I'm going to go after his people. Well, Mordecai was Jewish. So Haman has said himself to, I'm going to destroy all the Jews. While they've been captured here, I'm going to figure out a plan to wipe them all out. So it says, instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. Verse 7 of Esther chapter 3. It says, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, and Nisan is considered the first month. It's actually kind of March. Our first month is January, but Nisan was their first month because God says, from now on, this will be the first month of the year, and because that's when I'm beginning the Exodus and bringing you out, and then you're gonna celebrate the Passover at a certain point, you know. But we're gonna start in Nisan, and then you're gonna celebrate the Passover right after that. So he says, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur. That is the lot. So they cast Pur, which is like casting dice. They cast Pur before Haman to determine the day and the month until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So Nisan is right when the Passover. So it's actually kind of April, we'll say. Nisan is April-ish. It varies. You know how Easter is sometimes it's the very last week of March, sometimes it's the first week of April, sometimes it's the second week of April. It just varies. I'll just call it April. It'll be clearer. So Nisan is most often April, like this year. Easter is in like a few days. So this year Easter is on in the third Sunday of April. So they started throwing lots to try to see, when should we destroy all the Jews? Is it this month? Nope, not this month. They started in the first month. They started in April. Then they did May. Then they did June, July, August, September, 12th. Then January, February, March. March is the 12th month in there, and it's called Adar. So it finally fell on the 12th month. So that's when so they threw the Pur, and they said, oh, good, we're going to destroy them all in March. Yay, we found the date. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws are different from all of the people's, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it's not fitting for the king to let them remain. We should wipe them all out. So he was waiting for, like, when should I bring this up? When should I tell this to the king? We'll just keep casting lots each month, throwing dice, basically, to see when it, yay, we'll do it in March. So he finally went and approached the king. In Esther chapter 9, verse 20, it says, and Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews, near and far, who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar. Because between Esther chapter 3 and Esther chapter 9, Haman got killed. Esther did her job as a descendant of King Saul. Esther's descendant of King Saul, who should have destroyed Agag 500 years earlier. Esther finally destroyed she was a descendant of Saul, destroyed the descendant of Agag, A-G-A-G, 500 years afterwards. If Saul had just done what he was supposed to do, his descendant wouldn't have had to do it. But when God's saying for you to do something, he's going to have you do it or your kid do it, or say, you're still going to have to do it. So don't leave it for your great-grandchild to do. Do what God's telling you to do. So now that Haman has been taken care of by Esther, Mordecai sends the letter around and says, we're going to establish a holiday. We're going to celebrate every year the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the days in which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy from them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So this wasn't like Passover. This is the day where we celebrate. It's like Christmas. Yay. We give each other gifts and all that. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them and had cast pur, that is, lots, to consume them and destroy it. So they called the holiday Purim. They just added an I-am, right? And because since that's what he had used to determine when he was going to destroy them, and yet God reversed it, and God will do that. He ended up getting destroyed on the very gallows that he had built to kill Mordecai on. God will do that. Your enemies think they've set a trap for you, and God will end up getting them on that same trap that they set for you. They end up getting destroyed on it. So he built those gallows to get Mordecai. He ended up getting hung, and he threw the pur, and so they just called it Purim, and that's where they send presents. So Jesus is there on this holiday. Many people believe all just says a feast of the Jews. The only one that falls between January and April is this one in March, called the Feast of Purim. So a lot of people believe that that's the holiday that he's there for, celebrating freedom, right? So you thought you were going to die, you're not going to die. So there's a specific miracle that happens during this time of Purim. So John chapter 5, verse 2 says, now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which in Hebrew is called Bethesda, and it had 5 porches. So there's literally like a pool that was built like you would go to the YMCA and there's a pool. So it doesn't mean just a pool of water they built it around this spring because water would spring up every so often. So they built a pool, and they built 5 balconies that are covered in shade all around it, and people would come and sit in these balconies and wait for the angels to come. So we'll get to that in a second. For some reason, when I was reading this when I was a kid, I just thought it was called the Sheep Gate because they just needed a name for it. But literally, this was the gate that they made all the sheep come through. When people would come for Passover and they would be bringing their sheep in, it's like, you go through that gate. We got a gate for the camels, a gate for the horses, but we do not want the sheep mixing with anybody because they've got to stay pure. You've come to sacrifice unto the Lord. In Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 1, and when they built the temple, remember in Ezra and Nehemiah, this is when they're rebuilding the temple. So after they've been taken off into Babylon to bondage, the temple was destroyed. When the kings finally, King Cyrus, let them come back to Jerusalem, they rebuild the city, they rebuild the walls, and they rebuild the temple. And in Nehemiah chapter 3, verse 1, it says, then Eliashib, the high priest, thank you, rose up with his brethren, the priest, and built the sheep gate. And they consecrated it and hung its doors, and they built as far as the Tower of the 100 and consecrated it, then as far as the Tower of Hanel. And so, and there was 100 people who built one tower. Anyway, so they're telling you exactly where it is, and it's near the temple. It's right near the temple because the temple is near the east gate. And this is where this specific gate is, where only the sheep came in, and then they led them into the temple to be sacrificed for Passover. So there's a pool there right next to the sheep gate that has 5, what we would call, and porch is a good name for it too, a porch, because you sit out on your porch and your porch has a little roof over it. So we think of it the same way around it. Now it says, in these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the movement of the water. So again, there's all kinds of sick people. Some people who are blind, some people lame, can't walk, some people paralyzed. They're all, everybody, no, it's not like you're there with a stomach ache. You got something bad going on with you. They're waiting for the moving of the water, for an angel went down at a certain time, a specific time, into the pool and stirred up the water. So it's believed that this started happening around Passover. As they got near Purim, where the people who were all the Jews were gonna die, and yet God spared them from death, that the angel started showing up. This is not something that happened for years. This was a new thing that started happening kind of around the time Jesus was born. That this was a phenomenon that God started doing. Why? In Zechariah chapter 13, verse 1, it says, "In that day a fountain shall be opened for the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and uncleanness." So there's going to be a fountain that opens up in that day when the Messiah comes. God gives like 100 different ways of recognizing that the Messiah is there. So that no one can say, "Oh, we didn't know, we had no idea." Don't be mad at us that Jesus came and we didn't know it was Jesus. Really? God says, here's how you know it, and then I'll send Elijah, and I'll do this, and I'll do this. One of the ways, it says there's going to be a fountain that opens up for sin and uncleanness, and people will be healed. These healing fountains will suddenly open up. And that's what started happening into this pool. This water would come, and it would bubble up at a certain time. And then they go, "Oh, something's happening." And whoever got down there first would get healed. That was a sign that the Messiah was in your midst, that he was somewhere born. So that's why God started doing this. In John chapter 5, verse 4, the second part, it says, "Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had." In Ezekiel chapter 47, verse 1, it says, "Then he brought me back to the door of the temple." So Ezekiel's having this vision, and he's seeing, Ezekiel saw all sorts of stuff. He saw bones, dry bones, and all the bones came together and started dancing around. He saw all kinds of sorts of stuff. He had a vision. So he's saying toward the end of his vision, and again, all of this is, you're going to go through a dry period, and it's going to be like bones scattered in the desert. But then I'm going to bring it all back together. And that's when you can tell the Messiah is coming, because that dry period will be ending. So Ezekiel says in chapter 47:1, "Then he brought me back to the door of the temple. In my vision, I was flying all around, but now I'm back to the door of the temple, and there was water flowing from under the threshold of the temple toward the east. For the front of the temple faced east, and the water was flowing from under the right side of the temple and south of the altar." So it's this water starting to flow, and it's the same thing that Zechariah prophesied about. There's going to be healing waters, because it goes on to talk about the healing waters and the healing waters. So God's doing this on purpose. Every so often, an angel would come down and just trouble the water. The water would bubble, and somebody would get in and get healed. There are other ways to get healed. But God's doing this miraculous thing so that people who read the Bible would go, the Bible talked about when the Messiah came, there'd be a fountain of water open up. There'd be water flowing from the temple. And that's exactly where this pool of water was, flowing from the east and going to so that they're supposed to look at this and not just go, how come God's doing this and only healing one person? His point actually wasn't about the healing. God's point was, I want you to know that the Messiah, because it's healing for your soul, I'm most concerned about. So I'm doing this as a sign for you to go, this is unusual that this is happening at this point. I wonder what it means. Okay, John chapter 5, verse 5. "Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity, 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been in that condition a long time, he said to him, 'Do you want to be made well?'" Which is a fascinating question, because he's at the place where the water gets troubled. He's with all the sick people. Hey, it's like going to the hospital and asking people, "Hey, do you want to be well?" It's like, "Why do you think that I am here?" Which is kind of what the guy said. Duh. But there's a reason Jesus is asking. Because sometimes you can get so used to being in a certain condition that you think you want to be made well, but you can't even imagine things changing. That could be economically, spiritually, psychologically. You've been in a certain frame of mind for so long, you think, "Oh, I need this to change," but actually you're so comfortable with it, you don't. You're not ready for it to change. Because who would you be? I know I have some friends who complain. That's their life's goal in life, is to what complaint can I come up with today? And it's like, who would they be if they didn't complain? They wouldn't have a personality, because that's just how they're known. I'm the person that says, "Oh, woe is me," and sometimes, they want sympathy, but that's their identity. And so he's asking, is this your identity? Will you be made whole, or you want to be the person that complains? Well, now, um, here's one reason that Jesus says this. I'm skipping down to John chapter 5, verse 14, because after the man is healed, it says, afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made whole. You've been made well. Sin no more, lest the worst thing come upon you." So there's a couple of things in that statement. Apparently, something the man had done, had his own sin had brought this. So don't sin because a worse thing's going to happen to you. Not as punishment. Not that God is going to be, "Oh, look, you're sinning, you're gambling, cancer." It's not like that. I'll repay you for this sin with sickness. Whatever specific sin he was doing was bringing on the disease that he had. So stop doing that thing, lest the worst thing come upon you. Just make it even worse. So it's like somebody who's drinking themselves to death and their liver is rotting out because they're drinking so much. It's the drinking. It's not God's "Oh, you're drinking, I'm going to rot your liver." That's what the alcohol does to your liver. So stop doing that if you want or if you, if something. So it's your lifestyle sometimes that's causing the sickness. And you can say, "Lord, heal me, Lord." And I said, "Okay, I'm going to heal you." But if you just go back and start doing the same thing, it's going to be even worse. So somewhere in this man thinking, he might have been thinking, I brought this on myself. So God is never going to heal me. So that just Jesus has to come up to him and say, "Do you want to be made whole?" And he's attacking this man's thinking, because clearly I did this. I've got this sickness because I smoked cigars all those years, or whatever. I drank all those years, or I kept stabbing my foot all those years, and that's why my foot bleeds. Whatever it is that you're doing, sometimes you think you deserve your illness. Sometimes you think you deserve it. Yeah, God's not going to heal me of this because it's all my fault. So Jesus is like, where is your thinking on this? Because yes, your own particular sin caused this, but do you know God still wants to heal you, even though it's all your fault? He'll still want to heal you, but you've got to believe it can happen. In Mark chapter 2, there are some men who bring a paralytic man to see Jesus. Jesus is inside a house teaching, and in those days, the family room of the house, big square family room, had no roof over it. They don't have electric lights, so the big gathering place when you'd serve people and have a lot of people over was roofless. but it would be a two-story house, and on the second story there'd be like a balcony all around the square. So there'd be a square around the square. So there's a total square above you, but there's a walkway all around you also. And so they could take out palm branches and stuff. They could cover that up if the sun was too hot. Or you could remove the covering and look down inside. So these guys wanted to bring their paralytic friend in to see Jesus. They can't get in to see him. In Mark chapter 2, verse 4, it says, "And when they could not come near him because of the crowd, they uncovered the roof where he was." They went upstairs. They took the guy upstairs. They took all the palm branches off the roof so that the sun could just shine down on you. Must have been a hot day, and that's why they had the palm branches there. But they said, "No, we want to get to Jesus. We can't get through the door. We're going to go up the roof and let our friend down right in front of Jesus' face." So they had covered the roof where he was. So when they had broken through, they let down the bed on which the paralytic was lying. And when Jesus saw their faith, so how do you see somebody's faith? Like, if we can just get to Jesus, we know he's going to do. To let down some precarious man who's paralyzed in front of Jesus, you got to really believe Jesus is going to heal this man, because you can't go. If Jesus says, "I can't do nothing about this," you can't get into him to take him out. So you got to really believe Jesus is going to do something. So Jesus sees their faith, and God wants us to believe that he can do something, because it's a difference between loving God and thinking he wants to help you and will help you. So it's not a question of whether you love God or not, but whether you believe that He actually has the power to take your situation, and then whether He will actually do it. They believed if we let this man down in front of Jesus, He's gonna do something, and so we have to believe if I let myself down in front of Jesus, He's going to do something, and that's important. So as soon as He sees their faith, He says to the man, "Your sins are forgiven." Now that's a funny thing to say. I wasn't sinning right now. I'm paralyzed. Why are you telling me my sins are forgiven? Because in that culture, if you were paralyzed or blind, those are the afflictions, disabilities, whatever the word you want to use, that they believed this happened because of some horrible sin. Because a stomach ache you can get over, a broken leg is going to heal, all these other things. You have measles, it's going to go away. But paralyzed people don't get healed. Blind people don't get healed. And that's because whatever your sin was, it was so grave that God is really angry with you. And that's why He's paralyzed you. So if you were paralyzed, you're thinking, God's not going to heal me. God's not going to heal me. God's not going to heal me. Like this guy at the possibly, that Jesus approaches. God's not going to heal me. It's my sin got me into trouble. So Jesus has to let him know your sins are forgiven. Because I can't even talk about your healing as long as you think I'm not going to heal you. And if we're standing in front of God, no, I know you're not going to heal me. I'm just a mess. I just know I've sinned too much. It's all my fault. It's hard for you to muster up the faith necessary to believe that God's going to heal you. So He has to first let this guy, hey, your sins are forgiven. So whatever it was that you believe got you in this trouble, I've forgiven you. Now the people in the crowd, like, who man think He can forgive sin? You can't. Only God can forgive sin. So Jesus says in verse 8, immediately when Jesus perceived in His spirit that they reasoned this way in their hearts, this man don't have the right to do that. He said to them, why do you reason about these things in your hearts? Like, I just said you're forgiven, and you're like I can tell what you're thinking because you're giving me stink eye. So He says, what is easier to say to this paralytic man? Your sins are forgiven, or to say, arise, take up on your bed and walk? This is not a trick question. If I sent you to the paralytic ward of a hospital, what would be easier to say to somebody? God forgives you, or rise up and walk? Well, obviously, the easier thing to say is God forgives you, because you can just say that and leave and pat their hand. Oh, thank you. Rise up and walk. You better have some results. That's kind of bold for you to say to somebody. And Jesus is just literally saying, which is easier to say? Your sins are forgiven, or rise up and walk. So they're thinking to themselves, well, obviously it's easy to say. That's easy to say. So He says, but that you may know that the Son of Man has the power to forgive sins. Because you think you can't forgive sins. I'm going to do the hard one. So He says to the paralytic, I say to you, arise, take up your bed, and go to your house. So if I can heal this paralytic man, then you'll know I have the power to forgive sins. So if you see this man get up, then you'll shut your mouth about whether or not I can forgive his sins. Because clearly, if I can heal this paralytic body that you've decided cannot be healed, and there's a lot of things in this world that the world has said, oh, that can't be fixed. Okay, yes, it can. Yes, it can. So there are a lot of paralyzed things, relationships, mindsets, people stuck in their way. God can change hearts. He really can, and heal bodies. So I want you to know I can do that. I can forgive sins. I'm going to heal this man in front of you. But for Jesus, the most important thing was this man thinking that God hated him. His friends were cool. His friends letting this man down, but he's still wondering, because he's been told his whole life, you're this way because God is mad at you, and people love to make you feel bad about yourself. This is why this is all happening to you, because you don't know why somebody's in the condition that they are. But it was important this man knew that he was forgiven. In Mark chapter 9, verse 17, they bring, because I'm saying sometimes faith is important, not always. When people talk about healing, sometimes they will just, if you don't believe, God's not going to heal you. Sometimes that is a prerequisite that God gives, and sometimes it's not. It's not about faith. Sometimes it's just about mercy. Sometimes there's something else that has nothing to do with faith that's hindering a healing. Now, sometimes it is about faith. when Jesus was preaching one time in Mark chapter 9, it says, one of the crowd came to Jesus and said, this is verse 17, Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit. So I just want you to know who I brought to you. You haven't seen him yet, but I brought him in. He says, whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, he foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, becomes rigid. It's kind of like an epileptic episode, but that's not what it is. But we've seen things like this. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they couldn't. They tried. And this is right after Jesus had already sent the disciples out and said, go, I'm giving you power over unclean spirits and demons. So he's seen them cast some devils out. But this person, when he's brought my son to these kids, they couldn't cast him out. So he answered and said, oh, faithless generation, how long should I be with you? How long should I bear with you? Bring him to me. So he's kind of disappointed in the disciples, calls them faithless. Why were they faithless? Because somebody who's just sitting there, it's easy to go and say, come on in. But when they saw this kid who's foaming and rolling and rigid and stiff, they actually got scared. The disciples themselves thought, this ain't coming out. That's how they thought. Because look what they're seeing. So Jesus said, bring him to me. Then they brought him to him. And when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him. He fell on the ground. He wallowed, foaming at the mouth. So he asked the father, how long has this been happening to him? Because it's quite, you might get scared. You might become faithless and think, oh, this is horrible. We'll see homeless conditions, or we'll see conditions and think, oh, God can't do nothing about it. I don't know who. And we get scared. God's not scared. We're scared. So he says, how long has he been like this? And he says, from childhood. Jesus, in this case, needed to know how long. And sometimes, and we're not going to run across this a lot. Well, actually, in the future, we will. But we don't run across this a lot in American culture because we have so much education and wealth, etc. in general in this country. We don't see a lot of demon-possessed people. It takes a lot, like a whole lot, for someone to become demon-possessed because there's just simply oppression. There's upset. There's all sorts of something. There's all sorts of levels of demon attack that happen before someone gets possessed. And in our country, with so much light and so many churches and so many Christians, it's seldom that people get in that sort of place where the devil's actually able to possess them. Unfortunately, we are raising up an underserved community where we might start to see more demonic possession because they're not living in homes. They're on the streets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, like in some very poor countries. So America is becoming very stratified like that. And we might start seeing that. So in those cases, like in this case, Jesus needed to know how long he had been in this condition. And he says from childhood, Jesus is not just making small talk. That was part of what God was leading him to ask in order to cast this demon out. With the man who was cutting himself at the caves, Jesus had to know his name. Jesus says, what is your name? Again, not just making small talk. Oh, hey, demon, what's your name? He needed to know in that case the name of the demon. And there are rare occasions when you have to cast the demon out of someone, and I hope you're thinking, I hope I never have to cast a demon, and I hope you never do. I've seen two demon-possessed people, demon-possessed, for sure, and I've seen the demon cast out of them. I've seen them foaming and I've seen the demon come out of the person, and they look like a totally different person when the demon came out. So hopefully in your lifetime, you won't ever see anybody, but in one case, Jesus needed to know the name of the demon. And he said, oh, my name is Legion. And then he cast him out. So he says, how long has he been? So in the case, he needed to know how long he'd been there and what type of spirit he was from childhood. And he says, and often he has thrown him, the demon, has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. So my child will be sitting there normal, and suddenly you can see the demon attack him. And then he throws himself, the demon's throwing him, but the child throws himself in the fire, and then they have to pull him out. They throw him in the water, trying to drown him. The demon's trying to kill this child. He says, but if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. So we all feel for this parent, right? So Jesus says to him, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. So you somehow Jesus is requiring faith in this case. If you can believe, I just need you to believe. Then trust me, all things are possible to him that believes. And there's some situation that looks so daunting, it's hard for us to believe. But he's trying to instill faith into this person. That's what God is requiring at this point. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Like, I believe you, but it's hard. Help my unbelief. And that's okay. Jesus doesn't say, nope, sorry, you got to have perfect faith. Go home and, if there's a little bit of doubt, sorry. And I've heard people teach that. You had a little bit of doubt, and that's why God, and this man has a little doubt. I believe that you can do it, but just help the part of me that's scared, nervous, help my unbelief. That's all Jesus needed at this point, right? I just need you to have part of you believe. So when Jesus saw that the people came running together, like, because this child is now foaming and rolling, doing all the thing it does, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, deaf and dumb spirit, I command you come out. So he had to actually name the type of spirit. His name was not deaf. He had to name the type of spirit. Sometimes you have to know what kind of spirit. So he says, deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more. Then the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him. So the spirit, and you can think, oh, it didn't work. No, it's working. The spirit is giving its last convulsion, and then he's going to come out. And sometimes when you've conquered a situation, there's a last, and you can think, oh, no, it's even worse. No, God's not. It's over. That's just that last cry before it finally comes out. And he became as one dead, right? So many said, oh my God, he's dead, which is thank you for the people who right away, oh, it's dead. So thank you for people who just immediately jump to the worst conclusion. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had come into the house, his disciples asked him privately. So two things. I want you to know that the man, the child who had this demon didn't have any faith. It wasn't required. It was required of the parent to have faith that God could do it. So you got to have, sometimes the person in the middle of the affliction can't have faith. This child wasn't saying, yes, I believe, Lord. He's convulsing, right? He just needed the parent to believe. Sometimes the friend or the wife or the husband or has to believe for that person. I have faith. I'm here standing with them. Like the friends, they lowered him down. It says Jesus, when he saw their faith, we saw the friends' faith. So anyway, the disciples asked him, why could we not cast it out? So he says to them, this particular type of spirit can only come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. So somewhere Jesus was praying. He'd already got him to. So prayer and fasting, you got to be talking to God and asking him, how do I do this? Some people like to write the 5 steps of doing something, and they have a formula. Jesus is saying, formula won't work in this. You've got to be talking to God. Some situations you have to go into, and you can't do the formula. Well, when so-and-so took care of a situation, they lit 6 candles, and then they bowed to the east 3 times. So let's do that. No. You pray and you talk to God and say, Lord, how do I handle this situation? Jesus was talking to God, and God said, find out how long he's been in this condition. Find out what type of spirit it is. Blah, 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 and then call. So this comes out with prayer. And the fasting part is, which Jesus did a lot, is you've got to sometimes clear your head. Fasting, again, is not in order to move God, but it's to clear our minds of all the other stuff that we're distracted with. So sometimes you have to fast your books or your computer or whatever, so that your mind can be clear, so you can really hear from God. So he's saying this particular type that's been for so long in the shop, this demon didn't show up a week ago. This has been since childhood. This man's probably in his 30s or 40s. And this has been years that this child has been going through, that this son has been going through this. So someone that's been that entrenched, you really have to be talking to God. He says this kind. Really, there's got to be a lot of prayer and fasting going on, which is not what you disciples are doing. Your disciples are just running out there and trying to cast things out, and as soon as it gets hard, because when Jesus showed up, there was a fight going on. And and he's like, what's the fight about? And that's why the man showed up. Well, I'd asked your disciples to, cast this demon out, and they couldn't. So they were fighting among themselves, instead of praying and talking to God, they're fighting. Well, it's your fault, and I tried to get the demon out. So Jesus is saying you got to be. There's a lot of prayer and fasting happening in your life sometimes for certain situations, especially if they've been there a long time. So, but I just want to point out the father believed and yet doubted. I believe, but help my unbelief. The child obviously wasn't having faith. He's in the middle of the situation, and yet God was still able to do it. So it's not like in all situations you've got to have perfect faith. We've got to pray and see, Lord, what are you requiring? At this point, in Mark chapter 5, verse 25, it says, there was a certain woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians. I'm just mentioning that he mentions the physicians because Luke was a physician and Mark didn't get along with Luke. And so he says, she suffered many things of many physicians. This is the only place where this phrase appears. When other of the gospel writers describe this, they don't mention the physicians, but Mark does. But that's another story. So she'd suffered many things from many physicians, and she'd spent all that she had and was no better. So these physicians had just drained her dry of money, but rather grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she had said, if only I may touch his clothes, I'll be made well. So something had dropped down inside of her. And she knew, he didn't have to even lay hands on me. He didn't have to say words on me. I know that he's going to be so drenched with the anointing and the power of God. If I could just touch his clothes, I would be made well. So that had dropped inside of her. That's not a formula for every person. God spoke that to her heart. She had said, if I just touch his garment, I'm going to be made well. And so she followed up on what God had dropped in her. Other people would come and say, hey, Jesus, come and lay hands. Or another guy said, hey, Jesus, just saying a word and my child should be healed. So God spoke different things to different people. To her, God spoke and said, if you just touch his garment. She felt that in her heart. She went and made it happen. It says, and immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. She could tell it happened. And Jesus immediately knew himself that power had gone out of him. He could feel the anointing, like something just happened. I could feel it. He turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? So God had spoke to her. Jesus didn't even have to know that somebody was touching his clothes. God didn't say, get Jesus' attention and ask him and make sure. He just said, just touch him in the garment, you'll be healed. That's all God said to her heart as she did it. Jesus didn't know, but somebody touched me. Now the disciples said to him, do you see the multitude thronging on you and you say, who touched me? Hello, Jesus. There's about 100 people who touched you. You said, who touched me? He says, no, but the woman, fearing and trembling, now in a different version, they said, no, Jesus says, no, somebody touched me because I felt the power go out of me. So, but because he suddenly stopped, right? Everybody stop. So the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Okay, God spoke to my heart. I came, and he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. So here's a situation where faith was the key. It had nothing to do with unforgiven sin. It had nothing to do with obedience. Sometimes it's obedience required. It had to do with her faith. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. It says, now while he was still speaking, some people came to the ruler of the synagogue's house who had said, and they said, your daughter is dead. So right before this, a ruler of the synagogue had come to Jesus and said, please come and lay your hands on my daughter. So Jesus says, okay. So he's following there. So they showed up and said, too late, your daughter's dead. Don't trouble the teacher any further. As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not be afraid, just believe. So I know you just heard your daughter's dead, and it sounds like, oh, it's too late, and there were situations. The doctor comes and says to you, hey, sorry, you have leukemia. Or the doctor comes and says, sorry, and you hear the words, and God sometimes is saying, don't be afraid. I know you heard those words, and it looks bad, but still believe God can change the situation. So somebody out there who's listening to this Bible study has gotten bad news. The doctor has said, hey, this is, and like they said, your daughter's dead. So obviously the doctor didn't say to you, you're dead. But he said some bad thing. You've got this. And Jesus is saying to you, do not be afraid. Just believe that God can still totally heal that situation. So he permitted no one to follow him. So this is a matter of being obedient. Don't be afraid. Just follow me. Keep going. But Jesus said, no one else follow me except Peter, James, and John, brother James. So those are the only ones who are there. So Peter's there. That's how Mark knows about the situation. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult and those who wept and wailed, and they're crying and screaming. And he came in, he says to them, why are you making this commotion and weeping? The child's not dead, the child's just sleeping. Jesus is trying to change their thinking. You're weeping. He's almost saying the child's just in a coma, right? He's not really dead, he's just sleeping. Well, it says they ridiculed him. You're crazy. Because we're the people who, when there's bad news, we go, yes, how terrible. You have to decide if you want to surround yourself with the people who make it worse, or the people who are optimistic and who say, God can still fix this. He says, when he put them all outside, so Jesus, he made that choice, get out. I need to surround this situation with faith and people who can really believe that God can do something. He took the father and the mother and child and those who were with him, Peter, Paul, and James. Peter, Paul, I'm making that up. Peter, James, and John, and he entered where the child was lying. Now, the reason Jesus put them out, don't remember in Matthew chapter 13, when he went back to Nazareth, it says he could not do any mighty works there because of their unbelief. That's Matthew 13:58. He couldn't do anything because of their unbelief. So, sometimes there's so much, this will never work, this never work, this will never work, that the Spirit of God is not moving because there's too much people say it's never going to work. So you have to get rid of those people and surround yourself with the believers, right? So back to Mark chapter 5, verse 41. He says, he took the child by the hand and he says to her, Talitha Kumi, which means little girl, arise. Now, the little girl is in a coma or dead, one of the two. The little girl didn't have faith. The parent needed to have faith. The parent could have said to Jesus, let it go. Just stay. They already told me my daughter's dead. I give up. So the parent needed to say, no, I still believe God can do something. So even though I heard that bad news, I still believe God can do something. The little girl rose from the dead. Jesus spoke the words, arise. And so it wasn't like she had faith. She was dead. She could hear the words, right? But her spirit responded and went back into her body. Or she was in a coma. And sometimes people in comas can hear you. They will tell you when they come out of the coma, oh yeah, I heard everything. I just my body couldn't respond. So you may want to speak encouraging words to those people in certain situations. You may go to a hospital room and someone, the beep, beep, beep is going on, right? And they're asleep or they're in some sort of induced position. But you can speak to them and say, God can still hear you. God can still heal you. I just want you to know I'm here. I love you. God loves you. And, even though they can't respond, you want to speak healing words or positive words, if God leads you to do that. Again, this is not a formula. Go up to every single person in a coma and do this and it will work. God has to lead you. God led Jesus there. So immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age, and they were overcome with great amazement because they thought she was dead. So how you are thinking is important sometimes in a healing. If you're thinking, oh, I have too much sin, or it's too late, the person's already dead, or like this man. So getting back to the story, when Jesus says, will you be made whole? The man says, the sick man answered him, sir, I have no man to put me into the pool. Which is not what Jesus said. Do you have somebody to help you into the pool? He said, will you be made well? But the man's immediately coming up with his complaint and why it's not going to work. I have no man to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I'm coming, another steps down before me. So that's not an answer. Like, he should have said, oh, yes, I'd love to be made whole. But instead, let me tell you why it's not going to work. But Jesus said to him, rise, take up your bed and walk. Which he's saying, somebody's going to have to carry me down. And Jesus says, no, you carry the bed. Don't stop thinking of yourself as somebody needs to be carried. You think of yourself as the carrier now. Just change your thought. Instead of, just stop being the victim right now and be the victor. And just see yourself differently. Stop talking about all the reasons why it won't work. I want you to see this differently. You get up and you take up and just start walking. I'm not talking about going down to the pool. Do you understand? The pool is the miracle thing. But I'm Jesus right here in front of you. And sometimes we're looking for the miracle. I got to get to the preacher. I went to the church, but the preacher didn't come. Or I did this and I called up to the so and so, but they didn't answer. And Jesus is like, I'm here. I'm here. You don't need for the miracle person to show up at your house. It's okay you weren't able to get so and so on the line. I'm here. Arise, take up your bed and walk. And it says, immediately the man was made well. So he took up his bed and he walked. So that's his choice. He can either keep complaining or he can say, you know what? God just told me I'm healed. So I'm going to get up. That's his choice. So if God speaks to your heart, you can either say, yeah, but, I couldn't get so and so to pray for me. Or you can say, you know what? God's speaking to my heart that he can take care of the situation. I believe if he's speaking to your heart, don't fight it. Right? If he's not speaking to your heart, don't make it up. But if you pray, if you're talking to God, and Spirit of God comes to you, do you want out of the situation? Yes, I do. Don't tell the reason. Yeah, but Lord, it's been 10 years and no, I believe you can change it. So Jesus wants to know, do you want to be made well? Yes. Then get up. Go. If he's speaking to your heart, and if God's speaking that to your heart, let's not fight him and give him all the reasons why it won't work. But I've sinned, but nobody's here. But she's already dead. If God is speaking to your heart, yes, Lord. That's all. Okay, Lord. I believe that can work. I believe I believe, And so immediately the man was made well. He took up his bed and he walked. Now, the very next sentence says, but that day was the Sabbath. So we'll get into why that became a problem for the religious. It wasn't a problem for God, but it became a problem for the next little bit. Jesus got in trouble for it. And Jesus gets in trouble all the time for doing stuff that the religious say, no, you got to do it this way. We got our laws, and God doesn't go by our laws. And as soon as we teach ourselves that, we'll be doing better. So thank you so much. Yes, save this. Thank you. Hey, Bradley. So, and Rodney and all you guys, thank you for tuning in. And sorry, if I just happened to look up and see that his name. I will be on Sunday, which is Easter Sunday. We're starting the Book of Exodus. Just worked out that way. I did not plan it, but we're starting on Easter. And Easter and the Book of Exodus kind of go hand in hand because it's about it's about the freedom from all the slavery, and that's what Easter is all about. Once Jesus died on that cross and he rose from the grave, we were free from all the sin, etc., and the bondage of the devil. So we're starting Exodus and on Sunday. We'll be continuing in John chapter 5 next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. I so appreciate it. And I will talk to you later. Amen. Bye-bye.